Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. Now, with this one, I'm going to carry on from the last one, which is about being a great dad and what are the foundations for that. And I talked about the importance of character and how that shapes up. And I quoted my favourite philosopher of the 21st century, A.C. Grayling. So the nutshell basically is being intentionally inclusive as a dad. That's not just inclusive, that's not being connected with your partner alone. That's also being inclusive in your child's life and not simply as an overseer of, tasks and homework, but actually being part of their life in a constructive way. And I talked about that as being intentionally inclusive. Okay? So get in there, get wet and dirty. You can't swim in the pool unless you get into it. All right, so where to from here? Well, I want to talk about three particular values in intimate relationships that I think are fundamentally important in our endeavour to be a great dad and to evolve into a great dad, because we just don't simply arrive there and go, well, now let me pick my laurels and place them on my head and it's all good. We've got to work at it. It's a bit like working at a marriage. If you think that love and lust is going to carry you across the ages, then fundamentally you are sorely mistaken and will encounter a great deal of pain and sorrow as a result. Okay? So, one of the things that I do in my couples work and in coaching parents is instilling in them the need to look at their actions, but also how they deal with their emotions and how they articulate that. Now, I don't particularly tend to focus on personality, as this is not a constant in people's lives, although, we sort of often take it as that, and we have, funky little tests to go, yes, I'm an introvert or I'm an extrovert. And we use a lot of that stuff as sort of colloquial excuses for not actually stepping outside of our comfort zone. Personality is fundamentally the result of my temperament and my socialization, and it is going to be organic. I can choose within that which way I go. I know there are times when I'm intentionally introverted. I have always been involved in fairly intimate work that requires a lot of energy, empathy, a lot of presence with people at a level that most of the time in society we don't do. Now, in order to balance that out, I need to have time on my own. It's about my self-care. So, no, I'm not going to be heavily socially active in certain parts of my life because I need that space. I need to recharge. So basically, it's a lot easier to create a more stable foundation when we get in touch with our core values and we use those as a reference point in our relationships, whether that is with my partner, with the mother of my child, whether that is with the child itself, whether that's with friends, whether that's with the people I'm in business with. One of the things that I do when I coach leadership is, and when we talk about recruitment, don't necessarily recruit for technical skills. Fundamentally, that can be taught, that can be coached. You're better off actually looking at the person's core values and how closely they live by them. That's the important bit. That attitude that they bring to the community of work is what's fundamentally important. And that's true too of intimate relationships. Like marriages or partnerships, intimate partnerships. So when I think about what's made a significant difference in my own personal relationship, it's been my absolute focus on loving actions and on being respectful of my partner and responding cooperatively even if there is conflict. Okay, so the three core values that I tend to use as a guidepost, and I suggest really that anybody can pick those up and make them part of your own repertoire, is to be loving, respectful and cooperative, because if you put that in place, one of the things that your children are going to learn is to model that. Because if they step out of line, you pull them up. You go, hang on a minute, when you did X, do you think that that was a loving or a respectful thing? Were you cooperating when I asked you to do something and you chose to ignore me? So it's, in my view, fundamentally important that as a couple we need to clarify what these values look like in action. You know, it's all very well to say I love you, but am I going to really display that love in a meaningful way? And that's what ultimately counts. You know, actions, behaviour speak volumes. Words convey whatever they convey. So let me bring in the fundamental point in the previous session. So what's your vision of being a dad? If you adopt those values that we've just talked about, being loving, respectful, cooperative, how is that going to play out in your relationships within the family that you have? What actions might come from that? So that way, again, it's not really that different from having a vision for your business and determining what the culture of that business should look like. Now, most of us as men in our professional lives, we spend significantly more time doing that than seeing about how we can adopt that or adapt it to our family as a whole. So, you know, in that context, I get a lot of parents who talk to me about, you know, we need more rules. Now, let me give you a warning. I know that when I was a teenager and someone started flagging rules, one of the things that I would experience is feeling a real, almost physical resistance to it. Now, intellectually, I would then do a couple of things in sort of like a mental gymnastic. I would hear the rule, I would go, okay, and then as time went by, when these rules were appropriately enforced, I would figure ways out in which I could dismantle the rule. In other words, I quickly became a bush lawyer. Right? So I would have these arguments and debates with my parents about why the particular rule that they were expecting me to work to didn't really apply in this particular instances, because there were all these exemptions and conditions around it. And so basically what would happen is that it would frustrate the hell out of my parents, and there were times when, as a result, we would get into an argument, or I would end up sitting in my room for a period of time because I would lose it, become disrespectful. And one of the good things that I experienced with my parents that I always took out of it was they actually never really shouted or yelled at me. They spoke firmly, but I can't remember too many incidences, essentially, you know, with my mother if she raised the voice. My dad occasionally did it, but again, he didn't really yell. So that's something important to reflect on, because one of the problems with that whole process is if you get stuck on the rule and you get stuck into this negotiation process, at some point it's going to be very difficult for you to stay emotionally on an even keel. All right, so stick to the values, not the rule. Morality isn't rule-based. All right, we you know, a lot of stuff in life is legal, but it's immoral. Okay, keep that in mind. Watch this with politicians in corporate life, in business life. People go, oh, well, I can do this because it's legal. Yes, but is it the moral thing to do? And quite frequently the two are quite different. So ultimately what I'm saying with this is that by nature most teenagers are good bush lawyers, and they will tie you up in an extended negotiation that usually ends in frustration and often tears, and most often or not the parent raising the white flag, throwing in the towel and disengaging. So what the teenager basically learns at that point is that I've won, this works, and so we're going to continue with that. Whereas if you use values, it circumvents this absolutely torturous process, and it's going to be more likely to result in appropriate outcomes for both the parent, and I'm going to talk to you guys, you as dads, and your child. And the other part of it that it lays down is being consistent. You're more likely to be consistent if you use values as a reference point and not rules. So let me talk a little bit about the issue of love in our relationship. So, being a loving dad, what does that mean? What does it look like? There's all sorts of loves. There's the love that I have for my partner, for the child's mother, but there's also, my love of good wine or food or my bike or my car or whatever it is. But the point that I'm going to make is that fundamentally, the thing about love is that it's actually more than just a feeling. In fact, it's much, much more than that. Embedded in that emotion of love is what we think in relation to those values that we have that give my life and my relationship purpose and meaning. And those values are going to sustain my relationship. Not just with my partner, but as a child who's relating to me as a dad. So being a great dad should be, in a way, completely immersed in that feeling of love for the child, but also not being a doormat in that. So one of the things that's important in being a loving parent is that, and you're going to hear me repeat this time and time again, is emotional regulation. In other words, don't lose your shit. It will absolutely bite you. So how do I regulate my feelings? Well, I'm going to spend some time on that in another podcast, but not right now. So a lot of kids, a lot of teenagers especially, avoid their dad because from their accounts to me, is when something goes bad or wrong, dad loses it. And so they find different ways of avoiding dad in that relationship, and it becomes chronic. After a while, they really have very little to say to each other. Dad feels frustrated. He's also very sad and hurt that his son doesn't connect with him. And so it just becomes a major, major problem. Okay. So again, this is not just about the feeling of love, but it's also love in action, and the question of what is it that you model in your relationship with your child. Now, the second aspect to love, and I can't stress this enough, is the idea of empathy. And one of the thrusts in my thesis on masculinity is that patriarchy makes men inherently somewhat selfish or narcissistic. And that, by definition, reduces our capacity to experience our own emotions clearly, but more importantly in this context, to empathise with others. And that includes our kids. This is particularly evident when men move into all forms of needless sacrifice through aggression and violence. Now, if we begin to want to prevent the prolific use of violence in our culture, we need to be able to foster empathy in a big way. One of the things that's going to help, so the emotional regulation for me as a dad is important. My capacity to empathise with my child is important. And one of the things that's going to do is not just make them resilient against psychological distress or disturbance, but it's actually going to create a foundation of sound mental health. Now, in one of the podcasts previously, I made a very clear distinction between what I saw as mental health and what I see as psychological distress and disorder. Now, unfortunately, in my work, a lot of my work is about helping people to come out of psychological distress and out of psychological disorders. And whenever we are deeply in pain and whenever we are deeply disturbed or distressed, there is a propensity for us as men to resort to dominance and control. And one of those elements is violence. And it doesn't need to be physical violence. It can and often is more likely to be emotional violence. So, not only is there now a growing emphasis on educating young children to be more empathic, ironically, they tend to do that almost off their own bat at around the age of 2.5 and 3. But we've got to absolutely focus on adults, especially men, to exercise empathy, get in touch with what it's like to step into the other person's shoes. Now, it's also important to step out of them, but that's a big issue. And the great thing is that empathy can be taught. I get asked that question all the time. Roman Zarnik, the author of Empathy, Why It Matters and How to Get It, talks about 6 habits. Okay, so if you want to foster empathy, do 6 things. Cultivate curiosity about strangers, challenge prejudices, and discover commonalities. Try another person's life, especially mentally. Listen hard and open up, and inspire mass action and social change, and develop an ambitious imagination. Now, I've spoken about this before, and we're going to expand on that as we go along through our episodes. So right now, I hope this has been informative. I hope it's been challenging, and I certainly hope it's been inspirational for you guys as dads to step up and allow yourself to evolve into the great dad that you can be. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.